In 1964, they were England's newest hitmakers, but by 2016, they were blue and lonesome. In between, they made some of the best rock albums of all time. We're talking, of course, about the Rolling Stones, and we're about to count down their 5 best albums. That's coming up next on Track by Track. Hey everybody, my name's Kyle, and this is Track by Track, music reviews, news, and commentary. Thanks for tuning in today, and if this is your first time here, please take a second to click subscribe so you won't miss future reviews and more. Alright, so in the history of rock and roll, is there any band bigger than the Rolling Stones? Sure, they have their obvious rivals, but I don't think there's any other band that comes close to building the kind of legacy we see from the Stones. So today, let's take a moment to look back at their almost 60 years of music and take on the nearly impossible task of ranking their very best. These are my top 5 albums by the Rolling Stones. With so many acts with deep discographies, there always seems to be a transitional album, an album where the act seems to come so fully into their power in terms of the path they originally set out on that it truly marks a point of no return. The Rolling Stones reached that point on Aftermath in 1966. They were well known for their mix of originals and covers up until this point, but Aftermath marked the first time a Stones album would be made up entirely of songs composed by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Depending on whether you got the US or the UK version, the album kicked off with one of 2 classics, either Paint It Black or Mother's Little Helper. How do you even choose between those two? Such discrepancies were all too common back then, but are thankfully rare now. In any case, Aftermath was in many ways a proof of concept that showed the Stones were capable of so much more than just blues covers, and that their ambitions were significantly higher. This was the high point of the Rolling Stones up until that time, and it would soon be clear that there would be no looking back. Some Girls is often referred to as the last great Rolling Stones record, which I tend to think is a bit unfair. It was their final studio album of the 70s, and it certainly felt like both a culmination of everything they'd done over the course of that decade, as well as a preview of what was to come as they ventured boldly into the 1980s. It's true, the quality of their album output never again reached this level, but I'll defend many of their songs from that decade without shame. But on Some Girls, we could certainly see a shift was coming. Bookended with the songs Miss You and Shattered, I feel like this was an album that actually found the Stones with their fingers firmly on the pulse of the musical culture of the moment. The result is an album that may not feel quite as timeless in retrospect, but it still vibrates with the kind of dark energy that seems to power all the best Stones albums, as well as many of the not-so-great ones, too. Let It Bleed was truly a milestone for the Rolling Stones, kicking off one of the most perfect 3-album runs in the history of rock and roll. Released at the very end of 1969, the album marked a cultural turning point as well. The world was in turmoil, and here was an album that reflected that state, sometimes explicitly, and others with a more subtle undercurrent of unease. The whole thing wraps up with what may be the most perfect album closer of all time. You Can't Always Get What You Want is of course a more optimistic song than its title implies, but in that moment, staring down an uncertain future in the decade to come, it would take more than a little faith for listeners to believe they might truly get what they need. To me, Exile on Main Street is the Rolling Stones at their most dangerous. It came out in 1972, but it didn't enter my personal musical journey until about 1989, during my first stint on college radio. I was paying my dues on overnight shifts with either no defined playlists or no one of authority paying attention to what I was playing anyway. Thus, I dug deep into Exile. Here was a Stones album nearly devoid of hits, but already so revered that I needed to understand why. The freak show images on the cover scared me a little, but also clued me into the sort of dark, bluesy, almost concept album the band was presenting here. This was arguably the most cohesive album in the Rolling Stones' entire catalog, and I think it works all the better for not being all about the big hits. Tumbling Dice easily takes the crown if we're measuring by that yardstick, but Sweet Virginia has always been my favorite on the track list. Ultimately, Exile on Main Street was the Stones at their grittiest, one of the biggest rock and roll bands in the world, showing that they could still get down and dirty better than anyone else. And not just at that time, but for all time. From its tight collection of essential blues rockers to its iconic Andy Warhol cover art and the first appearance of the now classic Lips logo, Sticky Fingers is a perfect album. And it's an album that truly works best as a whole, as an album, not just merely a collection of songs. It feels almost ironic that this album doesn't feature any of the songs most people would think of when listing the band's biggest hits, yet what we have here feels perfectly tuned together. The opening guitar riff on Brown Sugar is one of the most essential licks in rock and roll history, yet it gets criminally overshadowed by Start Me Up that was still 10 years away. Meanwhile, Wild Horses is arguably the most heartfelt ballad in the Stones' entire discography, and perhaps their most covered song ever as well. Throw in so many other great moments like the muscular horn accompaniment on Bitch and the rollicking swagger of Can't You Hear Me Knocking. There's the country-tinged exploration of Dead Flowers, and the cinematic album closer, Moonlight Mile. From start to finish, Sticky Fingers is the most satisfying and perfectly assembled album the Rolling Stones ever made, not to mention one of the best albums of all time. So there you have it, the top 5 albums by the Rolling Stones. And with a career that spans 6 decades and more than 24 studio albums, there's more than a few other Stones releases that could have also jockeyed for position in the top 5. But what about you? What albums would make up your top 5 for the Rolling Stones? I didn't include any of their many classic live albums on my list, but maybe some of you would include them on yours. What do you think about the early albums? And should any of the post-70s music be considered among their best work? Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Once again, my name's Kyle, and this has been Track by Track. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, plus check out some of these other videos below that I think you might also enjoy. And of course, be sure to subscribe, because true music fans always want new releases the day they come out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.